Good Sunday morning, everyone. I want to welcome you in. Today is a special Sunday, and that we're launching a new series that'll take us all the way through the month of October as we study the Old Testament book of Job. And what we'll learn is that when everything falls apart in Job's life, he sees God like he never has before. And my prayer for you is that as things get rocky in your life, and we have certainly experienced some of that already, that you will experience God personally like you never have before. Now, the questions that we bat around a lot, whether we openly talk about it or not, is God in control? Does he care? Now, it would be so discouraging if you went through life feeling like God had no power over your circumstances, or if he had power to do something, but just didn't care to do anything. So the two questions that we're asking in this series is, God, are you in control of this world? And do you care about me? The questions are sincere when we ask them. And as we ask these questions, we hope that it is true, that God is in control and that he does care. Now, in Job chapter 1, it opens with Job living really the American dream. He is comfortable, his life is easy, his kids are healthy, his business is booming. And then by the end of chapter 1, everything starts to fall apart. Servant comes to Job and informs him all of his sheep, all of his goats, all of his livestock, and along with all of his servants have been killed. It's at the end of the day, it's been a really bad day. And there's no insurance adjuster that you can call to recoup all of his losses. But before the day is done, another servant comes to inform him that all of his kids were at his oldest son's house, and a storm came through and the house collapsed and all of his children were killed. Now I want you to hear what Job says at the end of chapter 1. Job chapter 1, verse 20. Job stood up, he tore his robe in grief, and then he shaved his head and fell to the ground to worship. He said, I came naked from my mother's womb, and I will be naked when I leave. The Lord gave me what I had. The Lord has taken it away. Praise the name of the Lord. So in this moment of loss and grief, Job is still worshiping. He puts his faith and trust in the sovereignty of God. But things don't get better for him. He begins to experience physical suffering. If you know the story, he becomes physically ill and he is surrounded by people who are tearing him down. His friends say to him, "What did you do to make God so mad? You must have done something for all this to happen to you." His wife is also convinced that God has turned his back on them. She says, "Curse God and die." So Job holds on to his faith, but he starts to ask some questions. God, are you in control? God, do you care? Now, I don't know if you've ever studied the Milky Way galaxy. This is our galaxy, but the Milky Way galaxy is just one of many other galaxies, and the Earth is just a speck in our galaxy, and you and I are just a speck on the Earth. And so when you look at it, you can kind of start to think, I'm a speck on a speck in a speck. I mean, we're really pretty small when it comes to the vastness of our universe, and it can cause us to question, does God really care that I'm having problems meeting the mortgage this month? Does God really care about my relationship problems? Does God care about the loneliness that I feel? Are we alone out here as we battle COVID-19? One of the things that we have been forced to acknowledge is just how vulnerable and fragile we are, and we care to admit. And so Job has some questions for God from himself, but I think one of the reasons that he's asking these questions is for you. These are your questions. God, can you explain the cancer? God, can you explain the abuse? God, can you explain the pain? And so we get to Job 38, and interestingly, God doesn't answer Job's questions. He asks Job questions. And these questions, they have a way of putting some things into perspective for us. And so in chapter 38 and verse 2, God says, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? In other words, who is this that pretends to know what they don't know? Who is this who thinks they can understand what they can't understand? And so he says to Job, brace yourself like a man, and I will question you, and you shall answer me. And so this month, what I want us to do is I want us to look at some of the questions that God has for him. Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth, is an example of one of them. Another one is, Job, did you determine how much water the oceans would hold? Or Job, did you determine the time the sun would rise? Job, did you know how many snowflakes are scheduled to fall on the earth? He goes on and on. Hey, Job, do you know how light travels? And after a few questions, it just becomes clear that God knows what we don't, and he understands what we can't. When we look at the universe, it really does not indict God as being indifferent or apathetic. What it reveals about God is that he is very much in control. Imagine if up in heaven, there was a control room with hundreds of dials and buttons, and every dial is set just right for life to exist on earth. If you were to get invited into that room, you'd have to be very careful not to touch anything on that control panel, because if you touched anything just a little, knocked it a little bit off, life would cease to exist here on earth. It's the teleological argument that design demands a designer. And so you don't get into your car not accepting the fact that it was designed and built in a factory. The same thing is true with your laptop or your iPhone. There's a designer behind it. Well, the universe is infinitely more complex than a car or an iPhone or a computer. And so what does it mean? Well, it means in moments like these, we have confidence that God is in control. The virus of sin has plagued our world, but we have a God who is working all things for the good for those who love him. And we have confidence that his hand is on the dial. And so I want to talk about a couple of these dials. God's hand is on the location dial. When it comes to the location of the earth to the sun, if the location was like 5% closer, the temperature outside this morning would be like 900 degrees. If the sun was 10% further away, we would be like Mars, a frozen tundra. And so God's hand is on the location dial. The proximity of the earth to the sun is just right. God's hand is also on the gravity dial. The moon is exactly the right size and distance to the earth. If it was like, let's say, just a little closer, like 1/5 closer, twice a day we would have tidal waves 50 feet high that would cover most of our planet. And so God's hand is on the gravity dial, keeping the moon at a perfect distance from the earth. God's hand is also on the rotation dial. Did you know that we're spinning at 1,000 miles an hour and we're orbiting the sun at 70,000 miles per hour? And the seasonal changes that we experience here in Alabama, that's when the earth gets closer to the sun, it starts spinning faster. And then later it moves away, further away from the sun and spins slower. Now, I'm going to stop right there, but if you do a little research, you would discover there are hundreds of dials, and they have to be just right. And let's say getting one of these dials right would be like winning the lottery, okay? But what if someone won the lottery like 200 times in a row? That would cause, hey, listen, if someone won it 2 times in a row, folks would notice, okay? But to have all these dials set would be to just win it over and over and over again, which is an impossibility. All these dials being set perfectly reveals that someone is very much in control. Von Braun, who has ties to Alabama, Huntsville, he came to this conclusion: my experiences with science led me to God. They challenge science to prove the existence of God. But then he goes on to say, but must we really light a candle to see the sun? In other words, what he's saying there, it's pretty much obvious, isn't it? The psalmist thought so too. In Psalm 19, verses 1-4, he says, the heavens proclaim the glory of God. The skies display his craftsmanship. Day after day they continue to speak. Night after night they make him known. They speak without a sound or a word. Their voice is never heard, yet their message has gone throughout the earth and their words to all the world. You know, it may mean stepping outside at night and looking up to hear that God is shouting a loud message, that He is in charge and that He is in control. And listen, you may feel like your life is sideways and you're traveling at 1,000 miles an hour. If you actually did the study, it's like the axis of the earth is at 23.5 degrees, and we are traveling 1,000 miles an hour. But things are not out of control because God's hand is on the control. I think part of our problem with God being in control, getting back to the story of Job, is that Job's initial problem with control is our problem with control, that we don't care for the way that God's controlling things. But I want you to know today, you and I are worshiping a God who is so much bigger than we are. He sees what we can't. He knows what we don't. And if God were to unfold the plans for the future, we wouldn't understand or comprehend it. You are not in control. I am not in control. You and I have never been. And so my prayer and hope is that you get a clearer picture of God. For some of you, maybe for the very first time. At the conclusion of Job in chapter 42, after all of his pain and suffering, after he has sat and listened to God, ask Him all of these questions, he says in verse 5, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." He went from hearing about God to actually seeing God. He went from knowing about God to actually knowing God. And his relationship with God went into a different level. That's my prayer for you. There was a picture taken from the Hubble Space Telescope in 1992. They thought maybe the center of our galaxy would be a black hole that would be so powerful that light wouldn't even be able to escape it. And so I want to throw up this photo. This is the photo that came back from the Hubble Space Telescope. And if you look at it, it's really interesting to see how scientists describe it. Some have even called it an X. But you know what it looks like to me? It looks like a cross. How about you? If there was ever a time when things seemed out of control, was at the cross. All the evidence you would need to prove that things were out of control for God would be at the cross. That's what His followers thought too. But there has never been a time in all of history where God's hand was not on the dial. And so to wrap up the message from 1 Peter chapter 1, beginning with verse 18, "For you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from your empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect." Look at verse 20. "He was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake. Through Him you believe in God, who raised Him from the dead and glorified Him. So your faith and hope are in God." And so the message of the cross is the message of concern, that God is concerned for you. It's a message of care, that God cares for you. I hope that you'll receive that this week. May God bless you all.